Hello and welcome to the latest episode in the Urban Manifesto webinar series. I'm Lucy Bullivant. I'm the founder of urbanista.org, and together with Prathima Manohar, the founder of Urban Vision, we have pooled our skills and resources to create a third platform, Urban Manifesto, a third online platform. Because the pandemic and transitioning through into a new era has raised some really profound questions about the priorities, the processes, and the whole visions, potential visions, and motivating forces behind urban design and planning. It's undoubtedly the case that there is currently and will be step changes of small and large natures that will really change the shape of our world. We need more of them. We need to ask what are the most meaningful strategies, whether they be fast-track tactical or slower, longer-term ones that will really produce profound change. Today's theme is making cities more mobile, and in a minute Prathima will introduce the theme in more detail and our splendid guest today. The idea behind the Urban Manifesto is to create, together with the help of a number of expert guests from many different disciplines and different continents around the world, moreover, a series of strategies and just to pinpoint and crystallize priorities for a happier, healthier, a more livable, and that means more equitable urban future as we go forward. We're very pleased to be part of the 100-day studio, which is being staged online by the Architecture Foundation. Now, through meeting the challenges brought about by the pandemic, through unlearning old ways which have lost their meaning or are actually really deemed to be downright helpful in the 21st century, our Urban Manifesto will be a real roadmap for resilient, progressive, and responsible urban change. So over to you, Prathima, to introduce the theme.
Thank you, Lucy. Transport is the backbone of our cities, and many cities have been, in a way, forced to curtail public transport during this health crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, transit agencies around the world saw their ridership decline by almost 90%. A lot of cities have been responding to this crisis by improving pedestrian access to ensure more social distancing, and are also turning to cycling as a robust and resilient and a dependable alternative to move around our cities. Over the last few months, where many cities across the world have experienced various stages of lockdown, many cycling systems in our urban areas, from China to United Kingdom to United States, have seen a surge in traffic, and many cities are responding to this new reality by opening up new tactical bike lanes. These changes are in a way transformative and can lay a roadmap for a city that is fair, healthy, efficient, with a high quality of life for all its residents. And this is the theme that we are going to explore today. And we are so thrilled to have Peter Murray with us today to discuss this very important topic. He's the Curator-in-chief of New London Architecture, and he's the chairman of the London Society. We were to also have another guest, which was in our original schedule, with Shahbaz Stewart from Brooklyn in the US. He's the CEO of ONE. We are hoping he can still join us, but there's been some emergency in one of his sites, so we'll probably not make it, but we're so excited that Peter is here with us today. And Peter, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing, and how have you been doing during this, pandemic?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So far, so good, really. I haven't caught coronavirus at all myself. I've been in lockdown, but been able to get out on my bicycle and do a bit of riding around town, and seeing lots of other cyclists out in the street as well, and also sampling some of the new pop-up infrastructure, which you just mentioned, which is being delivered right around London at the moment.
Peter, one of the things that's become a tradition in this show has been our segment of Urban Manifesto, where we request our speakers to share their brief 3-point agenda or plan for better urban futures, and in this case, on how to make our cities more mobile. So, Peter, what is your 3-point agenda for a better city life?
Right. Well, how we move around cities. I start, and I think we have an image there of what is called Bank Junction in the City of London. This is an image that I did a few years ago. Bank Junction is the key to the centre of the City of London. Now, for those who don't know, the difference between city and the City of London is that the historic centre, which we also nicknamed the Square Mile, is the central business district. So the City of London is really where the financial services are, the banks and so on. And it's a small square mile within the larger Greater London area. But this is Bank Junction, which at the moment is basically a junction with 7 roads coming into it. It has been in the past very dangerous, far too busy, far too much traffic, and actually a cause of much congestion. So a year or so ago, the City of London did put in temporary infrastructure to limit the use of the space to just buses and cyclists. But I painted this because I actually think it ought to be used as a public space, because it's really the centre of the City of London, really important public space. And so that part of my manifesto is that streets must be seen as the most important public spaces in the city. I mean, they are they cover a large area, and they are very significant in the way we move around the city. So they must be seen as public spaces, and they should be designed for people and not for cars. So that's number one. Number 2, and this is an image of Cheapside, which actually leads into Bank Junction. Now, Cheapside is the oldest high street, the oldest retail street in London, and at the moment it still has shops going down it, but it is a mix of traffic running through it as well as cyclists and pedestrians. Now, I did this picture more recently, and this is to show it really being used as a shared space. So I think that also streets should be seen as social spaces, and they should be seen as spaces of consideration between users and not ones of conflict. And I'm a great supporter of shared space when it is properly designed, and one that allows people to use space using different modes, but using it considerately and with respect for others in that space. And then my third one, and the image here is of Soho, also in central London, but not a part of the City of London itself. Soho, this image shows the street being used for restaurants. And this was an image I drew really to accentuate the fact that during a period of social distancing, restaurants need to be able to use the street as a place where they could actually put tables and the people can dine there quite safely. So what we need is more low traffic areas, residential areas and commercial areas, that are not full of cars speeding through, or indeed delivery vehicles. So in residential areas, children should be able to play in quiet streets. Entertainment areas like Soho also should have low traffic when people are wanting to use the streets, where pedestrians or cyclists. And I think the easiest way to look at these low traffic areas is on the example of Barcelona, super grids in Barcelona, where 4x4 grids are put together. The outer roads of those, that 4x4 is used for through traffic, but inside those 16 grids, you have an area where pedestrians have priority, and it creates a neighborhood and social space where children can play. So those are my three things with particular respect to how we move around cities and how we use streets as public spaces.
Peter, that's a grand vision for a very vibrant and fun city, and I hope our future of cities will have that kind of an urban life.
Well, let's hope so. And one of the places which I focused on there was the City of London. And the City of London has actually a transport strategy which I think is one of the best I know of any major city around the world. And at the moment, it has the advantage that some 93% of people actually travelling into the City of London, they come using active travel. So they either come by walking, cycling, or public transport. So it actually is a splendid place to start looking at how you deliver better space for walking and cycling within the city, because the City of London has the advantage that it's the historic core of London. And of course, in the medieval period, it was a pedestrian city. At that stage, people didn't have cars, maybe a few horses, but it was essentially built for people to walk. And there's no reason why people can't walk through it and in it today.
Yeah, fantastic. I can't help but notice the comment by one of our viewers, Ashok Goel, who has made the point that in India, all the planning is being done for the car and not for people. All the roads are for motor vehicles, not for humans. And looking out of my window, or when I'm on my bike in London, I can't help but feel that, in some parts of London, the cars really have come back with a vengeance in the last couple of weeks, as we're now, 3 months into lockdown. One of the very best of the sustainable transport experts, professor at University of California in Berkeley, Robert Severo, made a very interesting point a while back, and he said that planning of the automobile city focuses on saving time, whereas planning for the accessible city, on the other hand, focuses on time well spent. Now, under lockdown, getting out to spend time well in public space, whether we cycle, go for a walk, and or have access to nature, has really taken on a new meaning. As you know, so we all have suffered from so-called cabin fever. Peter, we're really interested to know what particular initiatives that you've spotted around London to make the city more sustainably mobile. Have you noticed during lockdown? And are you observing any changes that have been made by the Mayor of London or by the different local councils, all 31 of them, in one domain, influencing operations in another? And overall, which trends are likely to be a big part of urban mobility futures? That's 3 questions in one. Sorry for that.
That's okay. Well, I'll start off not so much talking about London as the UK as a whole, actually, which has seen a quite significant shift. And we have a Minister of Transport called Grant Shapps, who announced a whole lot of changes recently. Now, we have to remember that our Prime Minister Boris Johnson is a keen cyclist, and one of his moves when he was elected last year, as the government was elected and he became Prime Minister, he put a chap called Andrew Gilligan, who was his cycling tsar when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London. And he put Andrew Gilligan into the Ministry of Transport. And the Ministry of Transport, normally a very conservative and rather slow-moving organisation, has actually now, as a result of COVID-19, produced what is the largest ever boost for cyclists and pedestrians. And this is across the nation, not just in London, with emergency bike lanes and streets to help support the public transport network. They're now doing trials of rental e-scooters, and we've been very slow to respond to e-scooters in Britain up until now. The government is also working with leading tech developers to look at how they can reduce crowding in public transport, that sort of thing. So the Prime Minister is also going to launch a new cycling and walking investment strategy sometime this summer, which will look at delivering a way of doubling cycling and increase walking by 2025. And these are quite big moves, as I say, for a department of government that has been traditionally very slow to respond. And that links up to national health, and there is pressure to get doctors to prescribe cycling and exercise to their patients to keep them healthier and hopefully reduce their dependency on the national health system. So I think all that is really building up a whole lot of pressure to get people walking and cycling more during this period. But for me, the important thing is, how do we make these things permanent rather than just all the plastic bollards and wands swept away as soon as we come out of this current situation. I think it's very important that stuff is well designed, which is put up at the moment. And the Mayor of London, and you asked about boroughs, one of the things that people need to understand is that Mayor of London, he only is able to control about 10% of our sort of strategic streets in the capital. Most of the streets and roads are actually controlled by the boroughs, which makes it very difficult to have a London-wide strategy for dealing with these things. And so we're finding that the mayor has a really good policy of taking these bigger roads, which he looks after, using generally light segregation to increase space for cyclists, and also widening pavements so that people can social distance. But also some of the boroughs are also delivering improved conditions for cycling and walking, and others are rather slower off the mark. Because one of the really interesting things, and this is pretty important to how this has been delivered, that up until now, local authorities weren't quite sure how on earth they delivered all these changes. But what is it's made more obvious is that you can put in what are called experimental infrastructure, and that can be done without full public consultation, and also temporary works can be put in without public consultation. And so the idea is, and certainly this is the desire of the mayor and of the government too, is that when these things are put in, then they should be studied, see how they work, with a hope that they will become permanent.
Yeah, it's really refreshing, and I've returned to my bicycle after giving it up some time ago. But yeah, I mean, I think it is really, really ground shifting at the moment. And as you say, I think the tactical urbanism, that phrase is not very well known by the wider public, and it deserves to be, because everyone is encountering these very, very quick, these remarkably fast changes to all their streets. It is really quite uplifting, I must say, during a most very, very strange period in history. So yes,
there is a problem though, that as you say, when you look out of your window now, and I've been cycling. Well, today I've been out cycling, and certainly the number of cars now coming into London is huge. People are concerned about getting into the underground because of the problems of spreading the virus. So people are in their cars, and there is quite a lot of resistance among car drivers who actually think that it's really restricting their freedoms, not being able to move around as easily as they used to. But I do think that car drivers have to understand that in the city of the future, we will move around in different ways, and having totally free use of cars around the city is no longer a possibility.
I can't help but point out that you have a Brompton bike, your folding Brompton bike in your background, and next to your library. We need to do a shout out to Brompton, surely, for their tremendous work in providing Brompton bikes to NHS key workers. Tell us that story, would you?
Yes, well, it was realised fairly early on that actually people working in the National Health Service, nurses and doctors and so on, were having to go to work on public transport, which was thought to increase their risk of catching COVID-19. And so Brompton came up with the idea of giving bikes for heroes. So they made 1,000 of their bicycles painted in the NHS blue, and they were distributed to doctors and nurses so that they could cycle to work much more easily on a Brompton. And Bromptons are, I think, a really important tool, one of the tools for delivering more active travel. Because one of the benefits of Brompton is that you can actually take them onto public transport. In London, you're allowed to take them onto the underground, even in periods when bicycles aren't normally allowed. I think integrating cycling with public transport, really important. It's easier in some countries with more surface transport. Underground, obviously quite difficult to take large bicycles down into deep tubes in London, but taking a Brompton is really straightforward, simple. It doesn't take up too much space in the carriages, and it allows you to really move around London with incredible ease. I use them all the time, both in the centre. If I'm going out to the outer London, the suburbs, I can just put it on the surface rail or on the Metropolitan Tube, and I can get out to areas in outer London. But probably the quickest possible way to get there.
Yeah, good. So good on them. Good on you, Brompton. And as we've been reading and hearing on the news, the tragic reality that the pandemic infection is growing in other parts of the world, like beyond the ones it already is, like in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and in the global south, moreover. If bicycle manufacturers in every city in the world could consider a similar initiative to Brompton to help the key workers move around without having to get onto the BRTs, that would be really fantastic. Prathima, next question.
I think, Peter, your ideas of, some of these pop-up tactical interventions that we're seeing across the world, especially like cycling infrastructure and walking infrastructure, those are really crucial to a great urban life, but also to sustainability. And I hope, like you said, we will see some of these changes to be a more permanent part of our city infrastructure, because one of the things, if we go beyond the current moment that we are living through, the biggest crisis that faces all of us as humanity is climate change. And in a way, cities are at the heart of that crisis. There was a statistic put out by UN which said that cities barely occupy 2% of the world's surface area, but we're responsible for 75% of global energy consumption and 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you studied the ecological footprint, the energy footprint of any city, you know that 50% of the carbon emissions in our cities are linked through transport. So I hope, your prophecy that some of these, green mobility ideas like walking and cycling will become a more regular part of our life. We've seen that over the last couple of decades, while there have been reduction in energy use in other sectors, transport sector has consistently increased its energy footprints. I'd love to know from you, within your work, what are you doing to improve sustainable urban mobility?
Well, I've across a number of routes, I would guess, some of them personal, some of them through New London Architecture, and some of them within local groups here. And I would guess one of the key things I look back on, which was I felt was really important to my development in terms of understanding how one changed attitudes to cars, was in 2013 I cycled across the US from Portland, Oregon to New York, and then we cycled on to London, crossing over Ireland and Wales and England before we got to London. And the aim of that was to actually cycle through the States and look at what American cities were doing to improve the lot of cyclists. And we were inspired by what was happening in New York, and we knew quite a lot about the work that Janet Sadiq Khan, as Commissioner for Department of Transportation, was doing there. And also we were aware of Portland, Oregon as being a center for cycling. And so that's why we decided to start in Portland. So we went to Portland, and one of the really interesting things at Portland, they had pretty good infrastructure, but I have to say one of the really things that we noticed so much, they had really considerate motorists, and so the consideration of road users was a key part of how it really worked as a city. And I thought that was a really important message to take back, because one of the things about studying in the States, people said, why are you going to the States to look at this? Why don't you go to Rotterdam or Copenhagen or something like this? Because they're way ahead of the game. But actually, I think that in the UK, we have certain things in common with a lot of American cities, and the love of the car and the people not wanting to give them up, I think, is key part of that. And it was very interesting to see the interaction between the two in the States. As I say, we cycled right across the States, 4,000 miles, and it was really we found the consideration of both cars and trucks really much better than we found in the UK. We went to Minneapolis, which has got some really good cycling infrastructure, and we could talk about the sort of changing shape of the city, how younger people were moving into sort of the inner ring just outside the center, cycling into work, and using really excellent routes built into the place. We also find cycling across the large parts of the country. There were some really good off-road routes as well, not in towns, but through the countryside, which worked really well. We went to Chicago, where again there was a plan. This was 2013. They had a plan to deliver lots of cycling infrastructure by 2020. And one of the things that you really noticed in Chicago is the benefit of the gridded city. That's something we don't have in London. We don't have any grids at all really to speak of in London. And gridded cities are much easier to deliver this sort of infrastructure to than the more complex layouts of UK cities. We went to Pittsburgh, where the local community has been fighting really hard to improve infrastructure, the relationship between buses and bikes. So bikes can be attached to buses so that people can use both modes of transport. We went to Philadelphia, where the gridded system there works really well to provide protected routes. And they'd built, when we were there, some really good cycleways with really good sustainable urban drainage, landscaping, really exemplar projects. And then, of course, we got to New York. And New York is amazing in that they have delivered this huge number of miles of cycling infrastructure. A lot of it at that stage done very cheaply, because a lot of it was paint and pots, painted routes on the road, pots as protection from cyclists and from cars, between cars and pedestrians. So we looked at ways that, things we could learn from all those cities. One of the advantages, of course, Janat Sirleaf Khan had in New York, and Bill de Blasio still does have that the Commissioner for the Department of Transportation has much more power over roads throughout New York than the mayor does in London. And being able to deliver that, as you say, Lucy, that tactical urbanism at speed. Times Square was changed with paint and pots over one weekend. Then you could see, how did it work? And then after it's been working for a year, people will say, gosh, this has got to be permanent, because it's so, we never want to go back to the hellhole it was before. So we went across the states and we produced a report for Boris Johnson after we got back, and told him of our findings. So that was one of the things I did. That was myself and a dozen of us. We did that ride, architects and planners. And at New London Architecture, we do all sorts of research. This is one on public city, places for people, civilizing spaces. We've just done an exhibition on future streets and all that sort of stuff. We keep an eye on how attitudes are changing and how we can influence stuff. And then more locally here, I'm chairman of, I live in a place called Bedford Park, which when it was built in the 1880s was advertised by the developer as the healthiest place in the world, only 6 deaths per 1,000. Don't know what those statistics meant, but it was good marketing. And so we're trying to make sure that our area in the future should have healthy streets, healthier ways of living. And so the Bedford Park Bicycle Club is there to encourage new cyclists to join us, have rides around the place, and look at how we can improve the local area for local people to cycle, to get to the shops. And the COVID-19 infrastructure is really helping us in that. So our local shopping street is being turned into through traffic is being taken out of it, essential traffic access only. And that would be a great experiment, which would have been really hard to have done before. Great experiment where we can see that this works. Hopefully people will see that it's much, much better than it was before, and it will become permanent. So I would say I'm working across the various levels of sort of personal levels, professional level and local level, to convince people that they should get walking or cycling. And I think the job of people like me, and indeed people like you, who are in the communications game, as it were, is to keep banging home the message that this has happened. What we're about is changing attitudes, and it takes time to change these attitudes, but you've just got to keep on repeating and repeating the mantra. And the best thing, coming out of COVID-19, it is accelerating a whole series of things which we were hoping would happen, but have been taking a really long time. This is, I think, speeding them up.
That's nice to hear some positive news out of the COVID-19 nightmare. And your trip across US and UK sounds fascinating and lots of fun. How many miles did you cover in between states and UK?
Well, from the miles we covered from London, from Portland to London was 4,000 miles, or they would say 6,000 kilometers, because it sounds more. So
Wow.
that was,
how many days was this over?
We took 2 months, 13 days. And but if you cycled all the time, it wouldn't take you that long. But we stayed in each city we were looking at for 2 to 3 days, and we met up with members of the local departments of transportation, local cycling activists. And there is a movie on my channel on YouTube which actually will take you all the way through, and includes interviews with all sorts of people, from Janet Sadiq Khan to Paul Steely-White, who ran Transalt, and people from cycling community right across the States. But there was one area of activity which I guess I just didn't mention, and one is that is I'm a mayor's design advocate in London under Sadiq Khan, and I was also a member of Boris Johnson's design advisory group in the previous administration. And in that previous administration, we wrote a document which I edited called Good Growth. And in that, one of the key things I was absolutely insistent that we would put into that document was that the next administration should actually create a walking and cycling commissioner, not just a cycling commissioner that Boris Johnson had. And so this was in the document. And then it was really good that Sadiq Khan, when he took office, did take on most of the suggestions within this good growth document. And his policy, good growth by design, is what mayors' design advocates are really promoting. And one of the key parts of that policy, which has been implemented, is that we have a walking and cycling commissioner for London, chap called Will Norman, who is very active and is, again, like us, pushing for better and cleaner streets and healthier streets and better places.
So let's focus now on safety, because if we are going to persuade people who've never cycled in their lives, or people like me who got completely fed up with the dangerous nature of cycling in London, but now I've come back to it. So I've been persuaded by the current initiatives. We need good studies. We already have got some very good studies. And in fact, literally today, I read a very surprising thing, which is that London has space for almost 1,500 more miles of segregated cycle routes, which the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL has found on 1/6 of the roads. So if that was implemented, and apparently that could potentially be implemented fairly quickly, or more quickly than, say, HS2, our national high-speed rail project, moving towards a genuinely comprehensive cycle network in the city would really help to overcome lack of safety as a deterrent. What do you think are some of the critical steps that other cities can take to become more safer for both pedestrians and cyclists? It seems to me that has to be not only a cross-sector effort, but it has to be truly multimedia design effort as well. I mean, how much also do protected lanes really matter for a safe biking experience? And then this raises the question also of how bikes can be better integrated with public transit infrastructure.
Well, I guess that one of the key issues about delivering segregated routes is that one of the main reasons why people don't take up cycling is because they're worried about safety issues, and they certainly feel safer when they are in segregated lanes. But I don't actually think that you need to have segregated lanes everywhere. There should be plenty of streets in cities which are calmer and quiet enough for people to be in shared modes, and there should be other areas which don't have traffic in at all, narrower streets and so on, which can be turned over to purely cycling and walking. And I think that one of the really interesting pieces of work, and which I think other cities could follow, was a piece of work done by what's called the Urban Task Force, and a report produced by Transport for London, of which one of the key elements of it was called the family of streets. And this basically looked at 9 different street types. It was drawn out on a square grid, 3 by 3. Top left-hand corner were streets that were just for fast movement. And these are places you wouldn't want to cycle in at all anyway. And if you did, you would absolutely have to have a segregated route. Then down in the bottom right-hand corner of the grid, you have those places which are largely pedestrian areas, squares, plazas, areas where people would not expect to be wanting to move. So you had this shaded shift from movement to slower spaces where people would gather and enjoy themselves, sit out, and would not wish to be troubled by traffic. So once you understand the different sorts of streets you have, then you can look at what is the right sort of infrastructure to have. So, I mean, if you look at in the City of London, their view is that if you keep the traffic volumes below 150 vehicles an hour in each direction, then you could actually allow people to cycle if you give priority to cycling over motor vehicles. So that's where you could create that shift. If you've got more motorists than that, then you need to put in some sort of measures to protect one from the other. And one of the interesting things in London, we've been putting in a lot of really quite heavy segregated infrastructure, with digging up the roads, huge curbs, and a lot of change. Whereas actually there is quite a lot of evidence now to show that light segregation works pretty well, and a lot of the stuff that has been put in the last few weeks obviously is light segregation. And I think we will see a comeback of lighter segregation, which will allow it to be more flexible, far less costly, and deliverable. But I would say that segregated routes are essential in busily trafficked streets. Less busy streets, you can share the space, and in places where people are gathering, I think you could still have cycling in them, but you wouldn't have any cars.
Yeah. Very sound. Very sound. Thank you.
I want to talk about the fact in a more philosophical way that sidewalks and the bike infrastructure in any city, in a way, is about equity. And in a way, it reflects the city's humanity and democracy. Large part of the, in a city like Mumbai, for example, over 55% of people walk or cycle as their, basic mobility each day. But we somehow don't seem to be investing in walkable infrastructure or biking infrastructure. I remember a mayor from a South American city once said that a developed city is one where the rich take public transport or bike or walk, and not and not where the rich use cars. So if we go back into this big block that most cities have against this type of infrastructure, why is it, why do so many cities around the world have this ideology that gives higher priority for car-centric infrastructure than people-centric infrastructure like cycling or pedestrian oriented infrastructure? And if we could if you could answer why, I'd love to hear from you. How do we overcome this resistance and get people to give up their cars, which really have to be dismantled if we are going to make space for the biking infrastructure? One of our audience members also commented on this issue. Mr. Goel said people use car for transport, not for transport, but to show off their luxury lifestyle in a way. So I guess that summarizes the philosophical angle, but I'd love to have you kind of dig deep into it a bit.
Well, I understand absolutely your point about traffic in Indian cities. I was in Hyderabad just before Christmas in November, and I literally could not get out of my hotel, or I was too scared, you might say, to get out of my hotel without getting in a taxi to drive me out, just because you couldn't cross the road without taking one's life in one's hands. And you had to be a really experienced road crosser, a local person who knew it, to be able to do it without feeling absolutely terrified. So I think you're absolutely right. You need to bring some justice to roads. And one of the most depressing things in London, I think, in last year or so, is that the sale of SUVs, large trucks, which have no place in cities, is increasing, and everyone's buying SUVs rather than what they should be buying, if they're buying cars at all, is small electric vehicles that are better accommodated in the urban environment. But I think that, first of all, people like getting into their cars and having their own space. There is something about that they, particularly in a more alienating city, there is something that is comforting about being in your own space. You've got your entertainment there. You have climate control, all sorts of things that actually make it a nice place to be. And of course, you have a huge amount of advertising, which actually sells the benefits of having those cars as well. If you think that the cycling revolution we're talking about is basically been brought about by activists, cyclists, people agitating no money at all apart from subscriptions they might be able to collect from their constituency. But these groups have been up against multi-million pound and dollar advertising from car companies selling the benefits of their products. And so, I think the cycling, walking lobbyists have done really well in the face of that, particularly when you look at the fact that car manufacturing is really important to national economies. So it has even further support by governments that they continue to carry on producing lots of cars, because it means jobs, and one can understand that. But I think also, very importantly, that cars are seen as signs of social advancement, so that there are a lot of people who see riding a bicycle something that certainly was a time when that was something people cycled to factories in. So it was working class people used bicycles, and then as you moved up the social ladder, then you had a car. And I think that feeling is still the same. People like to show that they have a car, they have a nice car. And some years ago, there was some very interesting research which the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment did into housing design. And one of the key things I remember from that was that in the design of housing estates, it was very important to people that they should be able to park their car on the driveway outside their house, so that moving to a new estate was seen as a sign of social advancement, but also was having the right car sitting outside their house, not in the garage. They didn't park it in the garage, left it outside, so that people could understand how they had moved up in the world. I think that's perfectly understandable. that people want to do that, but it's not great for the environment. And then I think that in the growth of the car in cities really started to rocket after World War II, and that time socially, cars were really acceptable. And if you look at, for instance, any of the perspectives drawn by architects and planners in the 1950s and 1960s, they would show public space as being, dual carriageways, freeways with latest models of cars on them, people whizzing around cities on these very efficient-looking new pieces of infrastructure. And that's a real contrast to what you see now, because architects and planners, they deliver a computer-generated image, and all those spaces are now full of people walking and cycling, trees, sustainable urban drainage, all that sort of thing. And so attitudes have changed, but you want to realize that up until Jane Jacobs started to change things, reactions against motorways running through the centre of London started to change things in the 60s and early 70s. There was a shift, but it's taken all the time until now to really change the attitudes that we have to deal with cities in a different way. Because it actually took us a really long time to work out that the more roads you build, the more car ownership grows to fill them. And it's really, there was a time, I would guess, 60s, 70s, 80s, everyone thought, let's build more roads and then everything will be fine. But within a few years, all those advantages are lost as more people buy cars and fill the space that's available. I think we understand that now, and even the transport planners in government understand that now, and hopefully we won't see that as a policy in the future.
You're right. I think there's just layers of philosophical, economical, and social reason for why cars continue to thrive in our cities, even though we all know they're bad for our health because of all the pollution, and they're really bad. They're probably the biggest culprit as we battle climate change. And I guess it's one of the audience members, Arjun, writes that if government increases the frequency of public transport system, people will use less cars. So hopefully we can see more wisdom from our policymakers to change, to make public transit and biking more comfortable for all of us. So we can move towards those forms of more sustainable and healthier forms of transit instead of sticking with the cars.
Yes, well, we definitely need, all cities need a huge investment in public transport. And London has been unlucky in one way, but lucky too. It's unlucky in that we started our underground system very early on. So actually quite a lot of it is out of date. And for the last 10 years, been a lot of investment to make it work more efficiently. And now it's doing pretty well. As I say, if you look at the City of London, the central business district in London, that is well served by both surface trains and underground trains. And there, 93% of people will travel in using public transport, cycling and walking. And so that is proof exactly what the questioner suggests, is that you put in the investment and you get the benefits from that. But you will still have a residual resistance to people who want to bring their cars in. And so what you have to have is really active and taxable reasons for stopping people going in. One of the best pieces of legislation we had in London back in, I think it must be now 2004, was the congestion charge, where people have to pay, I think, I don't use it, so I'm not quite sure what the price is now, but I think it's about £12 to drive into the centre in a car. So that reduced the number of cars going into the centre by 30%. And it worked. It decongested the centre for a time. The problem is now that actually all that space has been taken up by private hire vehicles, Uber and taxis of various kinds, and also by multitude of delivery vehicles delivering products bought on the internet. And those have now filled up all the space that was available. And so I think the most important thing that actually cities can do in the future is to bring in road use pricing, so that what you do is you actually make sure that people pay to use the roads, how much they use the roads, but not just roads in general, but if they want to use busy city centre roads, then they actually pay much more. And if they're using it in suburban areas where there is low level of public transport, then they pay less. And if they want to go in at certain times, then they pay more as well. And the technology is available to do this, and we could easily deliver it in many cities around the world, and that would actually allow authorities to control the city much better. It seems to be an absolutely essential element to create a smart city in the future.
Brilliant. Excellent. Prathima, are we going to call for audience questions?
Yeah, I've been, I just want to say hi to the amazing audience who've been commenting throughout our live cast.
Making a lot of comments. It's really great.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. It's nice to hear all your views on a very important topic for a healthier, happier, and more sustainable city, which is how do we move around more sustainably. So let us know if you have any questions. You can just comment on the video below and we will get it. And we'll try to get Peter to answer one or two questions. We're almost at the end of the broadcast. We can go on a little bit longer than the hour that was scheduled, but please write to us if you have any questions. Lucy, I think it'll take a few minutes. I will curate it. Do you want to, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, of course, also to recognize that even cities in the world that we consider to be in the vanguard of cycling culture, really, really everything seems to be working so well, like Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Rotterdam. They were cities that didn't always have a lot of bikes, and it wasn't always easy to cycle around. And there were actually, it was due to a lot of citizen activism in the 70s, for example, that these modal shifts came. I think there's one quick question that I wanted to ask you, Peter, which is, the New York's plan for cycling, the Green Wave, came out July last year. We've got the Mayor of London's current streetscape, which we hope these policies will be longer term. That comes after the policy you mentioned earlier on, and then the one cycling revolution from 2010. What do you think? Do you think there's enough sharing of policy insights across municipalities across the world? Could politicians and policymakers spend more time talking to each other to share how to overcome operational and political obstacles?
Well, I'm a great believer in cities sharing information about all sorts of issues they deal with, and I would say that particularly New York and London are really good at sharing information, and we have a huge amount in common, just as we have a lot of things that are different. But I find conversations with New York hugely productive, and I would say in terms of walking and cycling, one of the aspects of that is that we're both cities of not dissimilar size, big cities. I'm always slightly concerned about comparisons between London and Copenhagen, or London and Rotterdam. Rotterdam is about the same size of Ealing, which is just one of our 33 boroughs. So these are very different issues we have to deal with. One of the key complaints you get in London from, you might say, the anti-cycling lobby is about lycra louts, people wearing, I think it's also called spandex, but sort of sporty clothes, people cycling too fast. How do you control those? But you have to think that in London you have a lot of people who are commuting maybe 20, 25 miles, and to do that at slow pace is just not really feasible. And those are the people who tend to cycle slightly faster than novice cyclists, and they're also the people who require some sort of facilities in offices and so on when they arrive there. If you have a much smaller area, local cycling is very different. And I think balancing those two types of road users is actually it's not easy, and something that I think we still need to address. I mean, myself, I used to cycle as a way of getting fit for longer rides. I gave that up a few years ago, and my attitude is to not break into a sweat on my bicycle. So I don't need a shower, cycle considerately and safely, and generally a little bit more slowly. Doesn't seem to make a great deal of difference as to the time you get somewhere, but my daily commute is 6 miles into the office, 6 miles back, and I do about another 10 miles around the town going to meetings. But I can do all that without getting up much of a sweat, except on the hottest days.
Thank you.
That is a ton of cycling.
That is
have to go to the gym.
It's been amazingly insightful journey into the issues that are at the forefront of sustainable mobility. I think it's really great to have both your examples of your lived experience, but also your policy insights as well. And we'll really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you together and I know we've referred to London and New York a lot and the States, but we try to bring in other global examples as well to make comparisons. We're not trying to say urbanism is about cut and paste. I think good urbanism has to be bespoke. It has to be based on lived experience. But thank you so much, Peter. And thank you to all of you who've made comments today. And
we have a few comments. Do you want to take it?
Sorry?
We have a few questions and comments.
Oh, do we?
Finally.
Yeah.
And I want to say, to your previous question and comments by Peter, we actually had a ton of best practices sharing from mayors of London, from Ken Livingstone to Boris Johnson when he was mayor, and even the recent Mayor Sadiq Khan on your congestion pricing, to drive out cars from central London to the super cycle highway that you are currently building. So Peter, you asked, we have a comment from Alan Crawford who says it's $15 and an extra $15. Sorry, 15 pounds. I keep saying dollars. Sorry.
It's controversially just gone up, and causing lots of tradesmen who need to carry their tools around to really, and delivery people, and not just people trying to get to work. It's caused quite a lot of consternation.
That's a comment to what the congestion pricing is currently in London. We have a couple of linked questions which we can try to, I think, which we kind of answered, but which we can quickly try to answer. From Arjun, on how can citizens pressurize government and policy making bodies to improve public transportation system? Mr. Ashok Goel asked the same question. How do you persuade politicians to agree to make parts of Delhi city only accessible by cycles? That's a $1 million question. And we have a question from Francisco Bohorquez, who says, thank you, Mr. Murray. You have great drawings. Is it possible to see your work in any publication or virtual place? So 2 different questions, but we maybe quickly address that. It'll take us a few more minutes from our broadcast, but Peter?
Well, I tweet them every now and then because I use them as a part of my advocacy, really, for particular changes. So Twitter's mainly, and I do have my own website, and a couple of them are on there, but not all of them. I'll make sure they are up there. But do feel free to download them or use them for any, if you wanted to use them for active purposes to try and influence people. Very happy that they're used to do that. But how do you convince authorities to deliver better public transport? I just think that it's a really long, arduous road because, as I said, you're up against real resistance from everyone from car manufacturers to taxi drivers, and you need to really advocate for change. And I would say one of the lessons one can learn is that you start off maybe protesting, but then as you start to sense that politicians are coming around to your way of thinking, you start collaborating and helping to press their message. And I think that shift from being a sort of protest movement to a delivery movement is really important. But it's a tough job. I would say number one thing is to try and get Jan Gehl from Copenhagen to come over and give a talk to as many influential people as you possibly can. He is one of the most convincing people to talk about how cities should be for people and not for streets, or for people and not mere conduits for the movement of goods. And he's really good at putting that message over. He's retired now, so he doesn't travel very much. But when he does, he has a real impact on local communities everywhere he goes.
I had the great honor of hosting him in Mumbai last year and walking him around streets of Mumbai. And you're right, we met with local councillors and political leaders, and it was a good way to open their eyes towards people-centric cities.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter, very much. Yes, and actually, if I could just personally add a comment there, I would say, yes, Jan Gehl, if you can get him, he does like to travel, although we're all we're very constrained in terms of global travel at the moment. But you could work in the spirit of Jan Gehl and create your own local manifesto. You know, do some research into your local areas, your neighborhoods. Spell out what is wrong with them, spell out what could be better and could be so improved in terms of public health, get some quotes from people on the street, put it all together, make your points, your manifesto points, and send it to your local politicians and invite them to take part in the conversation. I mean, Peter, as Mayor's advocate for the Mayor of London, has obviously had a very, very let's say very, very accessible conversations with politicians at the local government in London, and indeed politicians all around. And we're very grateful to you for your insights in sustainable mobility, because it is now at the very forefront of the urban conversation, and it needs to stay there as well. It perhaps has been a little bit put in the background, but I think we need to have it on the agenda and give it more bandwidth constantly. So thank you everybody for watching and commenting. Thank you, Peter, again. I'm very happy to say that next week, Tuesday the 30th of June at the same time, which is, what have we got? We've got, 4:30 BST, 5:30 CST, 9 p.m. IST, and 11:30 EDT, or check your local time zone. We've got the next session is the future of development, and we have two exceptional developers, Johnny Anstead, who is the co-founder of Town, who they operate in the UK, together with a leading Indian developer, Surendra Hiranandani, who is the co-founder and the managing director of the Hiranandani Group. So look out for our publicity updates on LinkedIn, and we hope to be able to tell you about some further exciting episodes very soon, coming to you every Tuesday without fail. Thank you very much for continuing to watch, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.